African Americans and others who have been discriminated for years in voting have more access to the ballot box?
We will absolutely, resolutely defend the right of all Americans to vote, including our African American brothers and sisters. It cannot ever be suggested that people are blocked from voting. And we have done a number of things in the Department of Justice.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Attorney General. It's a fact, there have been studies to show that voter ID is more discriminatory in its effect on African Americans and Latinos than anything else. Will you stop in defending voter ID law cases?
No. The Supreme Court has approved voter ID if properly done. Other courts have too. It can be done in a discriminatory way, which is not proper and should not be approved. But I believe it's settled law that a properly handled and written voter ID law is lawful.
Let me suggest to sir, with all due respect, we come from the similar region. I think we have a greater responsibility than anybody else in this country to see to it that African Americans get a chance at the ballot. When they were discriminated against, they were slaves for 200+ years, they were under Jim Crow, they weren't allowed to vote, and they're still being discriminated against. And I would submit to you and ask you to look at voter ID laws, access to the ballot, election day voting, early voting, and other indices that will allow people to vote that have been stopped. Secondly, on marijuana, you said that you are basically doing the same as Holder and Lynch. I believe General Holder and General Lynch abided by congressional appropriations that limited the Justice Department in enforcing marijuana laws where states had passed laws on medical marijuana and others. Will you abide by congressional appropriations limitations on marijuana when they conflict with state laws?
I believe we're bound by that.
Thank you, sir. That's great. That's great. And I saw what you did on crack cocaine was good. It wasn't as good as it could have been. Your proposal was a 20-to-1 ratio. Mr. Durbin's was a 10-to-1 ratio. Y'all decided on 18-to-1. You were a good negotiator, but Mr. Durbin took what he could get. But it should have been 1-to-1. But you admitted in that hearing that it could discriminate against the disparity against African Americans and minorities, and you ought to look at that.
I would just say that the net effect of that legislation was to significantly reduce the penalty one is subjected to for dealing with crack cocaine.
Yes, sir, and that was good.
That may be a better analysis than the 18-to-1 or whatever it is. It's generally considered a more dangerous drug.
Marijuana is not as dangerous as heroin. Would you agree with that?
I think that's correct.
Well, thank you, sir. I would hope that in your enforcement that you would look at the limitations you've got. There's always an opportunity cost, and put your opportunity cost, your enforcement on crack, on cocaine, on meth, on opioids, and on heroin. Marijuana is the least bothersome of all. 28 states or 29 states in the District of Columbia have legalized it for medical purposes, 8 states in the District of Columbia for recreational purposes. Justice Brandeis famously said that the states are the laboratories of democracy. I would hope you'd look at marijuana and look at the states as laboratories of democracy and see how they've helped. In states where they've got medical marijuana, they have 25% less opioid use. It gives people a way to relieve pain without using opioids, which inevitably leads to death and crime. And so I would hope you take a look at that.
We will take a look at it, and we'll be looking at some rigorous analysis of the marijuana usage and how it plays out. I'm not as optimistic as you.
You'd said one time that good people don't smoke marijuana. Which of these people would you say are not good people?
Well, let me explain how that occurred.
All right.
Can I explain?
Quickly. John Kasich a good person? George Pataki, Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, George Bush, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Judge Clarence Thomas? Which of those are not good people?
Let me tell you how that came about, Congressman. So the question was, what do you do about drug use, the epidemic we're seeing in the country, and how you reverse it? Part of that is a cultural thing. I explained how when I became United States Attorney in 1981, and the drugs were being used widely, over a period of years, it became unfashionable, unpopular, and people were seen, and it was seen as such that good people didn't use marijuana.
What years
That was
were
the
those?
context of that statement.
It might have affected
Time
my
of the
short-term
gentleman
memory,
has
but what years
expired.
were those?
Chair recognizes the gentleman.
One